listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How's it going?
Not so bad. Yourself?
Good. You know, I feel like a big complainer. We always are. One of our favorite inside jokes is, that sounds like a first world problem. Well, I've got good weather problems, right? I'm sitting here complaining because it's mid 40s and the rain has finally stopped. It's been rainy and cool. And half of the United States is under some kind of blizzard warning or, digging out of snow. I know you're in Chicago. You haven't had the best weather.
It has been difficult, I think for a large swath of the United States over the last several weeks. And yeah, Chicago has been pretty snowy. I think we're close to setting a record for like number of consecutive days with measurable snowfall, at least in the Chicago area, which is where I'm at. So and then obviously our friends down in Texas are certainly having some struggles with power issues. So for those who are listening, it is Friday, February 19th, as Jim and I are sitting here kind of talking about this. So if you want to look back in the archives of the internet, right, you can probably kind of figure out what was going on in the world back then. But the weather has been challenging, but I am hopeful. I am seeing above freezing temperatures on the radar and on the forecasts as soon as maybe even this weekend or maybe next week.
Always plan a trip down to Cancun. I don't think anybody will protest outside of your house.
Oh, that's cold, man.
Oh, that's not what you meant by the power issues in Texas? Oh, you meant something else. Sorry. We usually don't go there on this show.
We usually don't get political, but yes, that was not a good look for a certain individual in the Texas political spectrum. Let's just put it that way. So what are we going to talk about today?
I'd like to talk about role-based access control and all things associated. What do you think of that?
I think that is a gigantic can of worms, and I think we should do it because roles are something that we hear a lot from our clients as something that they want to get into. And it can be a little bit confusing sometimes because there's a lot of, different competing directions that maybe things want to go in from a role perspective, right? You've got role-based access control. You've got attribute-based access control. You've got policy-based access control. There's a lot of acronyms, and we're going to get into that today. So I think what we want to kind of start off with is, this is our thoughts on how you get started to eat this elephant one bite at a time, because it is certainly tends to be a rather large project for a lot of organizations. And a lot of times you are starting from maybe not the best from a data quality perspective, and you may have to, have a lot of kind of push and pull to kind of get things uphill.
Yeah, I mean, it's what complicates the topic the most for me is that there's not an industry standard definition. Like if you ask somebody who's an IAM practitioner, what does multi-factor authentication mean? You get the same answer every time. When you ask somebody what a role is, you get a different answer every time. And that's because a couple things. From an organization standpoint, we talk about roles differently. Application, even within an organization, you might have application teams talking about roles within their applications. And then you talk to the IAM team or the Active Directory team, and they're talking about roles at a totally different level. And then from an authentication side of the house versus an identity management side of the house, whether that you're using roles to drive provisioning to apps or you're interpreting those roles at the time of authentication to confer access. I think we had an episode, one of our original episodes, back when we used to do a lot of Jeff and Jim episodes, where we talked about kind of some of the most confusing terms in identity access management, and roles was probably number one.
Yeah, that highly liberal use of the word roles, can certainly complicate the way that things get defined. So we're going to dive into it here. And I think it's probably important before we get too far along here is really when we're going to talk about role-based access control or RBAC, is that we're really focusing on the provisioning side of things, not necessarily the authentication side of things, because like you said, there are sometimes some definition of roles being assigned at the authentication level. What we're really talking about is provisioning and really more authorization. So why don't we dive right into it? And why don't we start with what is a role, Jim?
Right. And so I'd say, like, if we were to give it a dictionary definition, it's really the collection of one or more entitlements or groups bundled together and assigned to one or more people in order to confer access to a system. So there's a couple elements there. One is that it's a grouping of access rights and it's assigned to people, or it could be to non-human accounts. So maybe people isn't the right term, it's identities, but it confers access, right? So the point of putting a role together is to bundle access. And so when we talk about even frameworks, we look at it has an access pattern, yes or no, right? That's an important piece. If there's not an access pattern around a role, then there's not much sense in developing a role.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways that I've heard it described in the past that I kind of like, it maybe oversimplifies it, but I think it's okay for this conversation, is think of roles as a bundle of sticks, right? Each stick kind of has its own maybe unique properties, and you might pick up and have different bundles of sticks, and you may have just one stick in your bundle, right? But each of those things could essentially be an entitlement, and that bundle ends up becoming what we kind of refer to commonly as a role. Um, so now that we kind of have set the stage of what is a role, why would someone want to go down this hellscape that it sometimes be of setting up access roles for their organization?
And when I think about roles, I generally think of, kind of the framework that we think about this is there's two types of roles. And we're going to use some terms, right? And some of these terms are used or not used by different vendors or organizations. But the two main ones for me are birthright roles and requestable roles. And when you think about birthright roles, the idea is that you can automatically assign access to a person based on something about them, some attribute about that person. They're an employee, they work for a certain department, or they work in a certain location. Usually, this is going to be an attribute that is stored on their profile, whether that's in the HR system or something that's maintained outside the HR system, but is data driven, that they are of this classification, and because of that, they should have this access, and that whole process can be automated. However, requestable roles are something that we don't have that driver of some attribute that's going to say whether or not the person should have access, and it's ultimately that bundle of sticks that we want to make available, and it's for convenience sake. And so having that bundle of sticks, now somebody ideally in the business is going to have to either request or approve or both that access for a person, or for like we said, a non-person identity. The more you try to genericize these definitions, the more it just sounds like a bunch of words. So I'm probably going to stick to more the simple definition. But if you have a requestable role, it's that bundle of sticks that you're going to give to a person. You're doing it in a way that the business can understand what that bundle is. So you're either going to tie it back to some job function or maybe to a job overall.
Yeah, I think let's stick with the bundle of sticks concept here. Is if you think about you're walking around in whatever village, and when you're born, you're given a bundle of sticks, right? That's just what you get, and that's a birthright role. And it could be whatever that bundle of sticks might look like. And then maybe you go to the shop inside your village, and you see a bunch of different bundles of sticks sitting behind the counter, and you say to the shopkeeper, "Hey, I want that bundle of sticks." Right. So that would be more of the requestable role. So maybe we can, that may be, again, a little bit too simple, but I kind of like it, at least for the purpose of this conversation. And it's important to mention the business, like you just did, because it's very difficult to do roles, and it's compounded if you do not have the business involvement as part of the definition of what those roles look like, who can have them, who's going to approve them, right? How do you make things that are appropriate for the business to understand? Because really, at the end of the day, it's the business's data and it's the business's roles. IT, and by extension, the identity and access management team or technologies that are associated with that team, are there to kind of support the business and to help them make more informed decisions. So it's important to understand that this is not an easy task. It is something that a lot of organizations struggle with. They are usually year-long or multi-year projects, depending on how complex, the access, matrix might look like within an organization. So that's something to certainly consider as part of this. It's not easy, and that's okay, right? We mentioned it's an elephant. You got to start eating that elephant one bite at a time. And these are some ideas on how we want to get started on that.
Contrast what we just talked about with the organization that doesn't have roles, and they really struggle to get identity and access management into a good place where the business can make informed decisions about who should have access to what. And they're looking at, a list of groups or, entitlements that are not put in plain English and not tied back to business functions, for example. It's hard for them to decide who should get the access. And then part of doing role management effectively is reviewing roles, reviewing the access that people have on a periodic basis. And if you're reviewing it and you don't understand, you're probably not going to start removing access that you don't understand what it actually is, and potentially have your employee not have the access that they need to perform their job. So what ends up happening is that people rubber stamp during the access requests and reviews. So that's a place that roles can be very valuable, especially if roles are done right. Right, you name them in a way that makes sense. You write descriptions. The descriptions should tie back to what access this role confers, and you have owners of those roles so that you can do role reviews effectively.
So we've talked a little bit about RBAC, or role-based access control. What does that mean?
I mean, for my money, when I talk about RBAC, it's the overall process of role management and how roles drive the access that people get. So it's looking at it from kind of a 360-degree perspective, from how you get the roles, how those roles help drive access, how people interact with those roles. Again, like we've been talking about, it's we touched on a lot of the different aspects of what makes a good role. And it's something that the business can understand, they can assign to people, and then those roles really become the basis for the assignment of who gets access to what. What would you add to that?
You pretty much covered everything. I think if we go back to the bundle of sticks, role-based access control is how do you create that bundle of sticks, right? Which sticks are going to go into the bundle, and does that bundle make sense? Do the owners of those individual sticks agree to become part of that bundle, right? And this is an area that does take some finesse. This is not necessarily a technology problem. This is more of a business process, and trying to make sure that you convert the Active Directory group that is labeled, IT-PRD-APP004, translates into something that actually makes sense. Oh, right, that is the server or the application that controls the cafeteria menu, right? So being able to make that translation and put that in front of people to have them make those informed decisions is where really role-based access control and the frameworks that go around it, I think, make the most sense. I know we've also talked a little about ABAC, or attribute-based access control. How is that different from role-based access control?
One of the things we said early on is we're going to focus more on the provisioning side. And so I think when we're talking about ABAC and provisioning, we're talking a lot about that birthright automation of access accounts. Where I really see ABAC as where I see organizations using it is more on the authentication side. In other words, applications are being given, rather than here's the access the person has, they're given profile information about a person with a lot of attributes, and that the applications can then interpret those attributes however they see fit. In other words, the decision point is at the application in terms of what access those attributes confer. So very much like, policy driven. Again, kind of on the provisioning side of the house, I think is really the interpretation of those attributes for automating the provisioning of access.
Yeah, I think you hit it right there. Sometimes ABAC is also known as PBAC, or policy-based access control. It's more of a runtime or real-time assignment of access. What's interesting to me is that it really kind of layers on top potentially of a role-based access control, right? If you're driving data into the application say, here is Jeff and he's in Chicago, that attribute of me being in Chicago may actually map back to a role within the application, but it's not being granted to me ahead of time because the application is determining, in a more real time based on the authentication and the authorization streams, what I should have access to versus something that I've always had access to, which might be, that role that kind of sits behind it.
I think what's similar in both concepts is that you have centralized management of that data, which is going to ultimately drive the access. In role-based, you're determining what data drives people to be in what roles, and then you're telling the applications, put people in these roles, versus you're just handing the data to the application. The application is deciding what access that person should have based on those roles. And so, but in both cases, you're centralizing that authorization data. There is a scenario also where applications are completely doing their own authorization management or group management, role management, whatever you want to call it, or they call it. What I think is that's usually a very early maturity step. That's where you have a lot of applications that kind of grown up on their own, and maybe you've done kind of a level one integration where you're doing single sign-on between the application, but you haven't really started to pull the authorization out of apps and manage it, at least manage the data centrally. And so that's kind of a, step two or phase two in kind of centralizing your applications, is that centralized management of authorization. But Jeff, if I could, one thing I wanted to do earlier was my little rant. And so my rant goes back to when we talked about what is RBAC, right? And kind of how do you get that bundle of sticks? And, the two methodologies that have gotten the most thought are around role mining. So kind of the starting with the data and kind of building roles that way, and role engineering. So kind of the top-down approach. In other words, the business saying, we need a role that does X, Y, and Z, and then kind of building a role around that. And, my rant, I'll just, to put it in black and white terms, is I think role mining doesn't provide a lot of value. At least when I've seen it in, and I'm sure this would get a lot of heat if we had a forum where people could just say, you're stupid, we gotten so much value out of it. But when I've seen examples of role mining working, it's taking that data that you have about users and entitlements, and it saying, looks like you've got an access pattern here that 80% of the people in this department have. Why not give that access to 100% of people? And so my thinking is, because we don't want to give people access that they don't need, right? If 20% of the people don't have that role and they're not banging on our door saying we need that role, why would you create that role and give that access to those 20% of the people? What are your thoughts on that? The principle of least privilege, every time we go into an organization, it seems like, let's say 90% of the time, they've got a principle of least privilege baked into their policies and standards around information security. So I don't see why you would want to give anyone access that they don't need.
Let's take a couple parts here. I want to get into this because that was literally my next question, was RBAC and competing against that concept of least privilege. They are competing concepts. So when we're talking with folks, and having these kind of conversations, it's okay, we want to be more role-based. And oh, by the way, we have this policy that says, we're least privilege. Okay, well, which is it? Because if you're assigning roles that have accesses to things that people don't need, then you're violating the concept of least privilege. And that's usually kind of a thinking moment when we're talking to customers and kind of thinking, okay, well, how's this actually going to work? And I think this kind of goes back to the whole role mining and the role engineering exercise as well, because I do see some value in the role mining, but I don't see, I see the value of the role engineering, and I think that they're most effective when they're done together. If you're trying to do one or the other, I think it's a lot more difficult to see the true value out of it, because the way I see it is, role mining is basically digging deep into these applications or systems, trying to figure out what are all the different access rights that could be in place for that application. And then basically just coming up with an inventory. So the mining is, you're going down into this, this mine, and down into the shaft, and you're trying to find, the different nuggets of gold ore, and those gold ore might be, the different entitlements within the application. It's great that you found them, but what do you do about it? And I think that's where role engineering comes in, is, okay, now that you know what those nuggets are, what are we going to do about it? Do we take this gold and refine it down to this purpose, right? Or do we leave this as a raw material for some other purpose? So I see the role mining more as a recon effort. Let's figure out what's out there, which is good, right? You want to know, because if you're trying to protect an application and you don't protect the application, the rights that allow edit access to a database table, and things go haywire, that's not going to be good either. So you kind of have to know both. And then the engineering comes from working with the business to say, okay, let's talk about what are we going to give access to people. And then how does that work with least privilege and the concept of roles? Because there certainly is a lot of risk-based decisions that I think that can be made there around, let's take the cafeteria menu, for example. Do we really care if everyone has access to that? Maybe it was not granted to certain people, maybe it was a mistake, or maybe it's a new app that just didn't get backfilled to the people who were here before the app, right? Probably not, right? The risk is low. Do we really care if we're having chicken on Friday, or ribs, or whatever it may be? That's okay. But if there are more sensitive accesses, then yeah, you probably do care. And maybe the role that you thought would be good for an entire team or a department needs to be split up, because you want to keep with that concept of least privilege. So I think there's value in the role engineering and the mining. And the mining isn't just finding the applications, right? It's also, or the entitlements. It can also be, what do the people have? And I see that as just an intelligence report that comes back to eventually someone in the engineering side of things, whether it's the role owner, the role developer, whatever it might be, whatever person is handling that, to say, oh, okay, yeah, Jim and Jeff both have this access, but Jim has this other access, but Jeff doesn't. Is that appropriate? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, right? And I think, whatever the differences are, comes down to risk. If it's because Jim knows that we're having chicken on Friday, and Jeff walks into the cafeteria, back in the day when we could actually go into buildings, and is surprised when the menu, comes up, maybe that's a risk we're willing to accept. Or maybe I'm just, really picky eater, and I need to have the menu in front of me before I'm going to waste my time walking down to the cafeteria just to find out we're having the same old thing. So that's how I kind of look at it, between the two.
I think if you take a real philosophical approach, that's probably not the right approach, right? It's you get value out of doing a data mining, and we use the cafeteria menu example because nobody cares, right? Everybody has access to the cafeteria menu. Like no one should care anyway. But there, it made me think of a few things. One was I saw a really good presentation, and I don't know who to attribute it to, but it got into kind of access management fatigue. Managers getting so many requests for access that eventually they just started rubber stamping because they didn't have time to think about it. We're all busy during the day, we're doing our job, and then you layer on all this kind of red tape. But if you really boil that down to only send the question to the approver when it's actually something that is worthy of an actual review, then you can get to the point where you actually have deep thought put into it. So you never ask about the cafeteria menu, but you always ask about access to SAP or whatever the financial system are. And then you have to decide everything in between, whether or not that requires somebody to review that approval. Another thought I've run into over time is with least privilege, applying that to privileged access managers. So it's kind of the same concept around assigning what is the risk to the access. And that's an area where roles can be very valuable, right? Because, if you have I think philosophically speaking, anyway, you should have fewer roles than you have entitlements, right? The idea should be you're bundling those sticks and you're not creating more bundles of sticks than actually there were sticks. So if you can get to that smaller number, it becomes an exercise that is more feasible in terms of actually assigning a risk value, something that can be used to determine what are the appropriate controls around that access.
Yeah, you touched on the design there, right? A little bit around, what do these bundles look like? How does someone get started designing roles or going down the RBAC or ABAC path for their organization?
Well, I think it's probably like a lot of IAM things, and you have to look at trying to get your low hanging fruit first, right? So I always think about with RBAC is you start talking about RBAC with people. I tend to think people think it's all or nothing, right? You're either doing everything through RBAC or you're doing nothing through RBAC. And when you see organizations that are actually on the RBAC path, they're usually never at the finish line, right? They're doing a lot of things with RBAC. And where I think organizations get the most value is the things that they can automate. So it's that birthright access, getting someone started on day one so that they have whatever it is, 80% of the access that they need in order to do their job. Um, and then beyond that, it's now you have to start getting into the the tougher stuff. So building those roles that are around functional teams or functional jobs within the organization and tying off the access. And it really requires somebody with expertise on what is the access that you need in order to make that successful. And so you need to pull in people from the business. And really, where I think IAM teams and IT teams should spend their time there is with the business units that really want to step to the table and invest the time to do this. So, in other words, if somebody's going to play along, you're going to get a lot further than if they feel like you're dragging them into it and you're making them do something that they don't want to do. I think when those other groups that are not participating see the success that's being bred by the teams that are participating, they'll want to participate as well. So that's kind of, I think the approach is, think big, but know that you have to kind of start small. And where you start is with the low hanging fruit, the stuff you can automate from. And then when it gets into the tougher stuff, first work with the teams that really see the value and are willing to invest their time into making this successful.
Yeah, I like the concept of starting big and starting micro. Maybe it's macro, micro. So when I say that, what I mean is, let's figure out, are you an employee? Right? It's kind of a basic decision. Maybe you're an employee, maybe you're a contractor, maybe you're a vendor or an intern, whatever it may be. Start with those giant roles that you can answer relatively easily and try to figure out if there are things that are in common that all employees get. Maybe it's VPN access. Great. Now you've got something you can add to that. Maybe it is the cafeteria schedule, right? Maybe it's a company intranet site, something like that. So you start with these very broad roles, and that's okay because you got to start somewhere. And then I like to start by dog fooding roles with my own team. So what I mean by that is designing roles for my own organization and seeing what works, what doesn't work, so that I can really kind of refine the process before I go to the next area, right? Another business unit, another team, et cetera. And I would certainly start with teams that are friendly to this process. It's a lot easier with a willing partner, that's for sure. And knowing that you're there to try and help it, and that there are going to be pain points, right? Let's figure it out together. But the idea is to, at some point, roll this out to the rest of the organization, and being able to design those roles and figure it out from a macro micro type of way. I like that approach personally, because I think you don't push off the value that you might be getting by trying to design a whole bunch of roles at the department level. You can get value out of, are they employee or they're a contractor, right? That could be enough to make a difference. And if you can say all employees, when they onboard, they get an Active Directory account with these 2 AD groups and this Office 365 or Microsoft 365 license, that might be, a good enough win to solve a couple of pain points, maybe from an onboarding perspective, right? It shows that you have some capability to get this done, right? So you start to build confidence in the organization, and that the money and the time that's being invested into this, is working. So I think that is a big part of it. And then you basically make the circle bigger from there, or you make the circle smaller from there, depending which angle you're approaching from. And you can do both at the same time, with the proper management around how you'd like that to work.
I think I really like your concept around eat your own dog food. I think that works really well within your whatever your IM group or some small contained group. I would say that IT generally is one of the hardest departments to take on in terms of designing roles for system administrators, database administrators. That's where it like becomes almost impossible. And so you might feel like you're swimming upstream if you start with IT. Uh, Other departments can be more stable, HR, finance, things like that, because those roles generally tend to not change as much over time as someone in IT or be as custom in that group.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think IT is probably hardest, and if you can start with something simple, right, you're again showing the value sooner rather than trying to tackle the really hard stuff, right? Get the 80% that will get value out of the stuff that you do know, and then either punt or figure out later down the road how you're going to handle the rest. And it's okay, I think, to not have a role for every single thing that's out there. That's the real is the realistic way to kind of approach this is different teams, different organizations, different business units, different geographies. Those will all play into whether or not a RBAC model makes sense, right? You may have a more mature role-based access control for certain teams and a less mature in other areas. Using the concept we've kind of talked about, maybe IT really only has an employee role, whereas finance maybe has an employee role and a finance role and an accounts receivable role, right? Something like that. And I think that's okay. You just have to be able to manage it effectively, and know when and where to pick your battles.
I would say one other thought I was having is we were talking about something like finance, and we think about ERP systems. A lot of times they'll already have a complex role structure within the ERP system. And so I think as an IAM practitioner, when you're looking to do enterprise RBAC, you have to kind of set what your scope is. I think it's a dangerous place to, volunteer that you're going to go into the application to solve the role needs within the app. You have to start with an expectation that the app has good enough application level roles. But so I think that's an important point. The other thing I was going to say is just that, I think finance is a really good place to start because that's where you're also going to find a lot of segregation of duties types issues and the IGA platforms that can really, identity governance and administration platforms that can tend to help build RBAC models and manage RBAC. They do a pretty good job, generally speaking, in terms of identifying segregation of duties and then baking those into the access request and access review process. So you kind of get a double benefit if you focus on that area and you're able to roll in SOD as part of role management.
I'm glad you mentioned segregation of duties because that's something that we definitely see a lot, especially in ERP and finance apps, things like that. And that's usually where we see relatively decent, if not good, controls around what the roles do because there is some more judicious thinking around who should have access to what in the financial systems, those sorts of things. Where we see a lot of organizations kind of fall down is cross-application SODs. So they may be really good at managing SAP and having the appropriate checks and balances there, but where the challenge comes in is if you have across different applications. So maybe not only are you an administrator in SAP, maybe you're also an administrator on this other application that is kind of outside the purview of finance that makes a toxic combination. Something introduces more risk to a certain process, things like that. So this is, I think, also an area where there is the potential to leverage roles and the different access controls once you're aware of them to say, hey, we have more visibility now of what people have access to and what they can do, not only within a system, but across systems. Does that make sense? Do we want to keep that going, or do we need to think of a control to, address that?
I think when we have these conversations, it's one other thing that has everyone who's listening needs to keep in mind is that, we try to make this generic advice, right? Or a generic topic that we're talking about, but especially when it comes to like role management, segregation of duties within the ERP system, it's going to be a lot different for a 500-person organization versus a 50,000 person organization. And, you just kind of have to take the advice and then kind of feed it in as one data point. But I'm sure either way, our fellow IAM practitioners out there, they become expert at doing within their organization and kind of are able to take these data points.
It's something where we're really talking here around kind of like guiding principles and how do we move forward with this. It is very hard to do. And I said it before. These are generally at least a year, multi-year long projects to do the mining, right? Find the entitlements and then figure out what do they do? Do they make sense? How are we going to, construct those bundles of sticks, right? Those sorts of things. So it is difficult, and it is something that can be done, but don't get too, I think, lost in the weeds, especially if you can start to address some of the macro type of role situations. So maybe we should talk a little bit about some of the guiding principles for role management that we've kind of talked about, around here in this conversation, but also maybe some more things we haven't mentioned yet. Maybe we can start with, what makes a good role versus not a good role.
One of the things there is a good role is going to be used a lot. The business is going to understand what it does, and it's going to apply to more than one person. It's going to confer more than one small piece of access. So the more it's used, the more people it applies to, the better the role is. What are some of your thoughts there?
Yeah, I like to keep it simple, right? Don't create roles unless you need them. I guess it's the same thing as, don't create an Active Directory group if you don't need it. Don't create, any type of entitlement. You're just creating more work for no reason. So take a look at the way things are constructed and figure out if you actually need to spend the time doing it. And maybe, if one person has this access and they use it, so infrequently, maybe that does make sense to leave out of a role and make it more on demand or requestable, or however you'd kind of like to work through that. So I think that makes sense.
Right.
What about a framework? So we've talked a little bit about birthright and requestable roles. And I feel like that's a pretty good framework to kind of start with when it comes to getting started with how do you want to, figure out which bundles of sticks you want to create and how they're going to be constructed. Maybe we can talk a little bit about that.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I think a framework means a way of thinking about a problem and something that's reusable and solvable. So to me, it's setting yourself up with a series of questions that you can ask about, kind of a workflow almost of questions you would ask yourself in terms of building role. Is it a good birthright role? That's what you would want ideally, right? Because I think you want to automate access where possible. If not, can it make a good requestable role? And if not, does it even make sense to have as a role? So the kind of questions you could ask yourself are, can I define the user type? So if we were using the example of interns, yes, I can, interns are a distinct group of people. Does an authentication or authoritative source exist for that user type? So maybe in our HR system, we have intern as a designation. If we do, we can still go down that path that it could be we could still be going down the path of having a birthright role. If it's not in the authoritative source, like the Workday system or the HR system, then it would have to be a requestable role, right? There's no way to automate the idea that somebody is in that grouping. Another question would be, can I define an entitlement pattern or an access pattern? So in other words, do interns actually have to, access the same types of data across the entire intern population? Or is there some subset of data within the organization that they do all need access to? And then, is the membership volatile? So an example I'm going to give here is that I worked with an organization that they would change their cost centers very frequently. And so even though it seemed like at one point, cost center could be used, it was coming from an authoritative source, It did define some access patterns, because if you're in certain cost centers, it kind of meant that you needed access to certain things. However, it was volatile. It changed so often for people as they did these reorganizations that it actually did not make a good role. So if the intern type is usually not volatile, right? People are, yes, they're interns and then they can move on to something else or leave the organization, but they're not switching different types of interns all the time. If they are, then it would potentially disqualify it as potential birthright role. That to me is what the framework is all about, is being able to kind of walk yourself through a questionnaire and being able to determine whether or not you're creating a birthright role, a requestable role, or the population doesn't make for a pretty good role.
Yeah, I think you touched on a couple of important things there, especially around data quality and coming from HR and other authoritative sources like Workday, SAP, Oracle, et cetera, is a lot of these access decisions are going to be driven by the quality and the timeliness of the data in those systems. So that's something that you also want to take into consideration when you're talking about how these roles are going to be constructed, and then where is the data going to come from, and from when, right? If someone gets loaded into Workday the day of their hire, that might not be a good spot to drive automation from a birthright role perspective too. Maybe things end up being more of a requestable role because you don't have the data in the time that you need it to be most effective. So I think that's something to also kind of consider.
Yep.
And you talk about automation, right? I mean, I think this is something that you grow into. You don't want to automate all the things all the time. You probably want to pick where you get the biggest bang and where you feel the most comfortable and safe from a maturity standpoint to be able to assign access in an automated fashion. You don't want to, create a role and it has the wrong access in it, and then you just gave it to everybody and put your organization at risk.
Yeah, there's something else there with the automation pieces. Typically, organizations are getting that data from an HR system, right? So those HR processes get bound to your processes for assigning access, right? So there is some governance required there, and that kind of also comes down to how stable that data is, right? If it's being changed, if you're trying to drive access off of something that a department code or a job code, and those job codes wind up changing every couple of years, you could create havoc.
Yeah, absolutely. It's got to be. This is where the tight integration between HR and IAM really kind of hits the most, because it's okay to make those changes. What's not okay is to not let the IAM team know that those changes are being made, because that certainly affects a lot of things downstream. So having a good relationship with HR, HRIT, whatever the right term is for your organization, and where that authoritative data is coming from makes sense. And maybe it's not HR, right? Maybe contractors or vendors are managed by a finance team, or maybe they're not being managed at all. We see that a lot too. So trying to design around those types of issues, we're not going to have the answer right here in this conversation, but at least bring it up so that it can be addressed as part of what is the overall rule strategy.
That's right.
So I think, we've covered quite a bit today, and, there's some other things that we probably could touch on. You want to have measurable results when it comes to that. You don't want to create rules that are unnecessary, right? Keeping it simple. Making sure that the roles are easily understood. So using plain language to describe what the role is and what it does, that'll help people not only request it but also approve it, and hopefully that you get out of the rubber stamping situation where a manager or whoever's responsible for the access just says, yeah, it's okay, because of apathy, they don't care, or because of fear, right? They're maybe afraid to take away something because someone can't do their job, and it ends up to become a 3 a.m. call on a Saturday or something like that.
I think you also have to think about the fact that people retire and leave the organization over time. Other people are going to inherit that ownership of roles, and they need to be able to inherit them and understand what they do.
Yeah, being the inheritance is a strategy that I like a lot. You don't want to break the chain, right? So if someone owns a role and they leave the organization, my basic philosophy is, okay, that person's manager should now become the owner of that role until they tell me who is going to do it instead of them. So that way you don't have this role hanging out there that doesn't have an owner or has a gap, in some way, whether it's approval structure or whatever. So I think being able to come up with, standard processes around that doesn't mean that they permanently own it, but someone has to own it. And you want to make sure that, you keep that link between the two things in place.
Yeah, and you mentioned something about measurable. I think that can be, using some measures or some metrics as you're rolling out roles to know how many roles have owners, or even if you're to look at like groups, they have owners, that they have descriptions that are usable. You can use that to make sure that you're closing the gap. But then also, as you've really gotten ahead of steam around using roles, how many roles are, how many people belong in a role, or how often is that role assigned? What you find, if you have low use of a role, it's probably one that you want to reach out to the business and say, hey, do you still need this role? I see that you're not using it very often, or there's only one member of the role. Is this something that's worth us investing our time into having a role like this? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but that's where that data can potentially, use those metrics. Don't only have to be to communicate out to the organization, hey, this is what a great job we're doing, but also having those metrics to do a better job of managing it yourself.
Yep, if you're building that role access tree, right, sometimes you got to do some pruning, and that's healthy and a way to keep it, manageable. So I totally agree with that. We've been going on for quite a while here around role-based access control and other things around it. Is there anything that you want to bring up before we decide to call it for this week?
We did talk a little bit about it, but I think the technology side of this is really the identity and governance and administration, or IGA space. And so, if you're kind of looking to do additional research, one thing I would also say when it comes to roles, right, taking it from this philosophical discussion that we've had today and turning it into something that's going to be very tangible, and where you start using specific terms to mean specific things, is you're going to adopt technology. I recommend that if you're going to adopt that technology, that you try to adopt the practices and best practices built into that technology. IGA is the space that typically does role management. And so I just wanted to point that out, that if you go down the route of say implementing a SailPoint type system, they have definitions on what roles are, business roles, application roles, things like that. Use that terminology, try to adhere to their best practices as well, because if not, you're going to kind of be swimming upstream.
Yeah, that's a good point. You buy a lot of these technologies, not only for the technology itself, but the process that comes with it, right? And this is what those technologies do. SailPoint, Savient, Clear Sky, a whole bunch of these other IGA players, they have a process that they follow, and generally it works. Otherwise, their application won't work. So, you want to try and stay within the bounds of that and try to, like you said, adopt those processes into your business so that you're not having to get into this world of customization and exceptions and, all the kind of things that come out of using technology in a way that it wasn't meant to be used, which you certainly want to try and avoid as much as possible.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think that's a pretty good spot that maybe we can leave it for this week. I feel like we covered a lot of ground on RBAC, ABAC, PBAC, and a bunch of other acronyms I'm sure that we threw in there as well. So don't forget that you can, visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com. You can see us on Twitter at IDAC Podcast. And with that, we're going to go ahead and talk with y'all in the next one. Thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.